So we've all had tickets that have had these characteristics. It could be somebody going, yeah, we talked about it. They know what the requirements are. And then 6 months down the road, you're looking at that ticket again being like, this says reference a conversation, but it was so long ago that now no one remembers this conversation. Or my biggest problem is I look at a ticket and go, who wrote this? This is not any good. Going, oh, I did. Whoops. All of these are really common symptoms that happen. But it's really challenging to teach other people who may not necessarily have a technical background the level of detail that's required in order to be able to say this is a good ticket versus this is a ticket that needs help. So the way that I kind of help make the language even for everyone is trying to describe a to-do list. So these are all items or tasks in your apartment or in your home that you might need to do on a regular basis. And if somebody handed you this list, you'd know exactly what to do. You'd have that idea and say, okay, this is the list of things I'm going to do. This is how long it's going to take me. Great. Not a big deal, right? We all know how to do that. However, there's also a level of assumption and expectation built into somebody else handing you this list. Because this is a really common outcome for having a spouse or a significant other or children, parents, any other kind of roommate, where something happens and you realize that the job that you've done or that somebody else has done doesn't meet what was expected. So we're going to have a little audience participation here. What would your definition of doing the dishes be?
Rinsing them off and putting them in the dishwasher.
Rinsing them off and putting them in the dishwasher.
Just literally putting them in the dishwasher.
Putting them in the dishwasher directly? Anyone else have any other definitions?
Waiting until the dishwasher is finished and putting them in the cabinet.
Okay.
Hand washing.
Hand washing. All of these are great examples, but if all of us lived together, we would not have a clear understanding of what that definition was. If it's, leaving them in the dishwasher until now you need more dishes and you go into your dishwasher and get them. I will admit this has come up in my life recently because I had a friend staying with me and he looked at me and goes, somebody I know hand washes their dishes and then puts them in the dishwasher. And I was like, that person is me. You remember doing the dishes at my house before. So things like that all have a very different level of expectation. Also, if you're like me, you have a particular way you like to load the dishwasher. This comes up a lot in my family because my mother claims that my father also loads the dishwasher wrong, so she gets real annoyed about that. But wouldn't you prefer, as much as the list is longer, getting a list like this from somebody, saying, this is the quantity of dishes we're talking about because we've just had people over, or this is the size of our family. All the dishes need to be rinsed of remaining food, so, if you had lasagna, you don't have cheese sitting on your plate that's going into your dishwasher. Rinsed off, nothing left on it, put in the dishwasher. You already have all the tools you need, so you don't need to go hunting around for soap, anything else. Growing up, we once had house guests that once complained that my mother didn't leave instructions on how to use the stove. My mother had labeled the entire kitchen with, printed out labels where everything was for these nice people. So expectation matters. So, same exercise, but talking about doing the laundry. Who's got an idea? Who has the expectation of what doing the laundry would mean? You look like you have something beneficial to it.
Just throw them in the washer, put them in the dryer before they get stinky in the washer, folding them.
Okay. Anyone else?
You have to sort them first.
Sorting, yep. What about the other side of it? Once they're done with whatever method you use, that's also a critical portion of that, right? Because while all of us in the room don't necessarily have to iron regularly, there are a lot of items that need to be ironed or folded or put away. Or if you're like me, you get dressed out of the dryer. Not a big deal. But saying to somebody, okay, especially if you're thinking about how would I ask a small child to do something, which is not always the best way to phrase things, but in terms of level of detail, they need to be very, very literal. So you're saying, I have now done this work of, I have sorted the laundry. It is now in 3 bins. Great, you already have all the tools you need. You don't have to go hunting for them. You're going to put it in the machine. You don't need to add fabric softener because that might be a question that makes someone nervous and push off the task if there's some uncertainty there. And also saying you're going to use the dryer with dryer sheets, fold and hang all of your clothes, and put them away. This is the kind of list I would leave for certain people because I also knit, which means I have hand knit socks which can't go in the dryer because they will shrink. So this is probably a more critical example of things that can go very, very awry if expectations don't match what's actually done. So this is kind of the approach that I take to thinking through every single ticket that I write. And this is something that is a work in progress. My team would definitely vouch the fact that not all the tickets I write have all of the detail that's necessary. But the idea with thinking these things through is eliminating all of the assumptions that you're making. Because all of us hold context and hold things that we've learned in past experiences in our brains that we may not realize we actually have to communicate to other people. But giving that level of context definitely helps in order to make sure that a week later when you get the results, you say, okay, this is actually what I was expecting, and I know what to test, and I know what to do in this situation. It also helps so that you don't get so far down the line that you're getting something completely weird. You also don't get bothered with, hey, this scope actually is very, very different because I didn't realize I had to do, thing A, B, and C. So with that, one of the other things that I really like leveraging is points. And I know that points get thrown around a lot, and I know they have a real bad rap from some people, but I prefer them over levels of effort straight in hours for a lot of reasons. For me, it helps give a clear understanding of the scope. You've now given it a numerical value that says, yes, it falls in this bucket. A 3-point task for a senior developer is the same as a 3-point task for a junior developer. What varies is how many points they can take on in a given amount of time. And what benefits you there is that they are supposed to be a team effort. Your whole team has to buy into this is the idea because, pausing for a second, did anyone ever do that survivalist activity in any class where they are stranded after a plane crash and they have all of these items and they have to rank them? So some people have. So the idea is you have to rank all of these items based on what you think you're going to need. And then you get in a group of your classmates and you do the same activity and you argue against each other to figure out what the proper ranking of these items that you're left with after this plane crash should be. And then they had all these survivalists and experts do the same activity, and they show you your ranking. And the idea is that based on your group ranking, you should be closer to what the experts say than what you did on your own. Same thing goes for points and asking questions and really, really hashing things out. Most of the time, the benefit of points more than a numerical value is making sure that everyone's on the same page. It happens a lot more than you think, that two developers will look at the same ticket. One will go, yeah, I totally get this. The other one will be like, yeah, I totally get this. And then they'll give it 2 different point values, and trying to talk them back to the center unleashes a whole bunch of other requirements or assumptions that you weren't planning on having and that you didn't necessarily account for from the beginning. The other benefit of these is that you can run tasks that are assigned points in parallel with other tasks. So cloning databases, uploading large files, things like that are things that you kind of have to pay attention to, but not really. Versus in an hours estimate, there's the active hours of work versus this is going to take us a really long time because we have to let this thing just run forever. So that's why I like points better than numbers estimates. It's also a lot harder to say, is this going to be a 2-hour task or a 3-hour task? It's like, well, it's an hour. In terms of planning your whole week, that's important. But I know a lot of people struggle with the idea of points and time. And I will say, in my experience, somehow it just works. That most people I know and the developers that I've worked with manage to hit a velocity where they're able to accurately assume how many points they can take on in a week. And sometimes that's a little bit of a stretch, and sometimes they're a tiny bit light. But the first team I ever worked with that used points did 8 points a week per person. We did 24 points a week as a development team every single week. And we were able to commit to that so I could take a look at our backlog and say, okay, pending the 12 million bugs that are going to eventually come in that are going to reprioritize this, I can tell you we're going to get this project done in 3 weeks because this is the grouping of tasks that we have anything to do. But obviously, that comes up with this problem. You can't give points to something you have no context for. Or if it's a brand new technology, or if you're still trying to figure out what it is it means to do this. So if you're looking at a ticket being like, I understand what needs to get done from the user perspective, but I don't understand from the technology perspective because I just haven't dealt with this problem yet, it introduces one of my favorite concepts, the time box. And I think time boxes are sometimes used incorrectly in order to get tasks done. They can be used that way, but they're most effective for limiting the research time that you're going to do. So for example, I've worked with developers who have said, okay, I have to go figure out how to pull a report out of this system I've never used before. And I said, okay, take 2 hours, go dig into the system, figure it out, and at the end of your 2 hours, the goal is not for me to have the report, but the goal is for you to have an actionable ticket where we can pull this report. Same developer, 2 separate instances. One, he walks out 20 minutes later, looks at me and goes, so I'm already done and I already know how to pull the report, can I just do it? And I said, of course, you have those 2 hours allocated, by all means get it done. The next time he came to me and was dealing with Salesforce, which we all know is a little bit of a beast sometimes. So he spent his time on there, walks out of his office and says, I still don't understand how this works. And I said, okay, great, let's talk through what you learned in your 4 hours of exploration and then we'll come up with the next steps. So we had our next steps, acted upon them. He did a little bit more research, also in a time box, and then he had actionable steps to complete the task at the end of that. And the idea behind that was to prevent him from spending a week and a half, 2 weeks, exploring and learning all about Salesforce and still not being able to solve the one tiny problem we needed to solve. So it really does benefit everyone to limit that we're going down the wrong path. Let's head this off early, because most people are really hungry for knowledge. They want to learn more and they want to be able to do all the things. And while that's all well and good, it's sometimes not helpful when you're trying to reach your end goal of get this project done. So obviously, this renders the question, we've talked about points, how do we set them? So the best example that I found is working with keystones. So starting with a group of common tasks, and then being able to use those as examples and saying, okay, let's set these as relative weights compared to the other things that we've got going on. Because then, rather than saying, oh yeah, that's always going to be a 3. If you have somebody new join your team, they're not going to have any context as to that. But if somebody who's not necessarily a developer on the team can say, well, is this task more like building this really simple content type, or is it more like building this really complex separate content type that has all these added features and bonuses and pulls in all these other modules and other things? It helps contextualize and give a little bit more weight to why we gave numbers to certain things. So again, they are determined by group effort. It's a little bit easier to use the Fibonacci sequence, and it is a best practice to use that, because even in real practice, it's a lot harder to tell somebody the difference between a 3, a 4, and a 5 than a 3 and a 5. So the other way that this was explained to me that I thought was helpful was it's kind of like t-shirts. People can be a little bit too large for a small t-shirt and making them a little bit too small for a medium t-shirt, but they still have to fit in one of those 2 buckets. And it's not always going to be a perfect fit, but it's going to be close enough that it works. So the other way that I kind of like to explain keystones is with fruit, and talking about the relative size of fruit, because trying to explain tickets and keystones gets really far down that developer path. So looking at a grape, an apple, a cantaloupe, and a watermelon, we can kind of assign points to these based on their size, right? That is a grape singular. I know that grape in a bunch would definitely change that estimate, but that's the scope of this, is single grape, but trying to find a picture of a single grape. They look like lots of other fruits in that case, so I went with the bunch. But we could say that a grape is a 1. It's relatively small. We know you see a grape, you know what it is, not a problem. An apple's about a 3. It's roughly that much relationally larger than a grape. Cantaloupe could be a 5, and a watermelon could be an 8. Now what happens if I've given you this set of keystones? We understand this. We're good on we've ranked these in terms of size into our nice buckets. So what about a pitaya? First of all, who's heard of a pitaya? Right? Kind of a problem when you get something where you're really sitting back and going, I have no idea what you're talking about. So I would start with a time box. In this case, let's say about 5 minutes of me Googling, trying to figure out what size a pitaya was. So pitaya is a dragon fruit, it's indigenous to the Americas, and it's a type of cactus, and that's what it looks like. Great, I now know a lot of things about a pitaya, but I still don't know what its size is. And I will tell you, even in real life, this took me a while to figure out exactly. I've eaten a pitaya, I knew it was dragon fruit, but could not figure out its relative size until I found this picture. So by this is the end of my time box. I have now finished that I know that a pitaya is roughly twice the size of an apple. So this is going to be another audience participation moment, where would you put it on our lovely list of point values? 5? Sounds like most people are in agreement on the 5, which is awesome. Look at that, we've just group estimated for the first time. Yay! So the idea on this one is, going back a slide, I would probably actually go towards an 8, personally. Again, there is no right or wrong answer with estimating. It's based on the group. Every team is going to be different, and that's why keystones are important. Because it could be that someone sits there and goes, we're going to use zeros. I was like, okay, 0 seems like nothing, but it's basic HTML changes, stuff that they know that they can farm out to other people or whatnot, that aren't going to actually add into their groupings. But other teams might say, okay, HTML changes are consistently a 1 because we still have to actually go in and do something. Therefore, it's a 1. And as your team gets better at it, you will notice that they develop more of a gut instinct for, this is what I think this ticket is going to be, and this is what I think it's going to be. And as a product owner, I've developed that too, and it's carried over well enough that I can usually look at things and say, hey, I kind of have that idea of what it's going to be. And the idea with estimation that helps is doing blind estimation. So in this case, I asked you, you told me. Great. What works in real life is actually having everyone either use their Scrum cards or their fingers, which most people really enjoy their fingers for adults, just like flashing numbers. People get really excited about it. But it also helps hammer out, is there any uncertainty in this? Because obviously I have now thought it's an 8. Most of you thought this was a 5. We could spend the time talking about why that is. I would categorize this as an 8 because that apple looks real small compared to the pitaya. But we don't have a picture of the apple and the cantaloupe. So it could be that everyone else disagrees with me, which is fine. But I'm also going to then work my way through my assumptions and what I'm thinking, while all of you would work through your assumptions till we can come to an agreement. And sometimes in past when I've talked about this with other people, they said, well, sometimes I end up with a 50-50 split of the room. And I said, okay, but have you really talked it through? Because most likely you're going to get somebody who changes sides. So I've had 2 developers in the same room who've looked at me and said, okay, yeah, this ticket is good. We understand the scope of this ticket. And I said, great. They estimated it. One gave it a 1, the other gave it a 3. And I said, thought we were clear on this one. What's going on? And one goes, well, there's a module for that. I can just use that. The other one goes, well, if there's a module for that, I'm going with this person because it is a 1 if we have the module. And we then wrote it into the ticket, provided links, and everyone then was on the same page. So that sometimes is the most valuable, is when people don't agree, because you're really able to push through all of the assumptions that you're making. Because especially with senior level developers, there's a lot going on in their brain that they haven't necessarily verbalized as clearly as they can. And so taking a step back and asking to really think through all of those assumptions is really helpful. So when I did this keystone setting assessment with one of the teams at Chief, I had a senior developer who would start with, well, I assumed. And I was like, no, that's not the point. Every single time you have to not assume anything. It's better to have too much detail in that ticket than not have enough. And with that, how many of us have just written product details or ticket details in the comments, right? A lot of us are guilty of that too. So it's also a matter of making sure that all of that ends up in the description and is easy to find. Yesterday I went hunting through 51 comments trying to find a link that I needed that was in comment like 23-ish. All of that's great, but it's also wasting time. So to be more efficient, it helps to make sure that you're clearly making changes. The other thing that I really think is important is once a ticket gets started, denoting that any change in requirements has been a change in the ticket, not just editing the description itself. Because obviously I can commit to, yeah, that's a 1, that makes total sense. But if all of a sudden in the requirements we've discovered somebody else goes, hey, can we tack on this other thing? It's important to log that change has been made. Because all of a sudden, it might not be a 1, it might be a 2 or a 3, depending on how that scope creep occurs. So my overwhelming goal on a lot of these is to let developers do their jobs. The less questions they have for me, the happier I am, because it means that we've done a good job hammering all of that out. Also because I feel like sometimes when you're in those in those development adjacent roles, you ask for a lot of things and then people go, oh no, look who's coming, which is my least favorite reaction. So I like when I just get to stop by and say hi and don't have to ask people a million questions about, what are you working on? What am I getting? What are you doing? Do you need things from me? What's going on? Because those are all great questions, but it's nice when you're not disrupting somebody else's flow to get those answers. So, kind of as our wrap up and talking things through, doing one other quick example of going from crummy ticket to slightly better ticket, and there's definitely a lot of things we could add, but I didn't want to make this slide way too text heavy. So starting with, if we were going to build a page that had each congressperson's contact information. Great, there's definitely a lot of people that could go and just build that, and it wouldn't be a problem, and you'd get something and it would be fine. But it also opens a lot of questions. What are we building this in? Are we making it editable? When we're saying editable, does that mean that it should be a content editor, or does it have to be a developer making these changes? So I'm going to say, let's make it HTML and CSS. Relatively low level of effort to make changes, but still requires some kind of technical ability to make that change. Okay, great, but we still don't have a clear idea of what contact information means. So we're going to say name, district, image, and email address. No Twitter, no Facebook, no other forms of communication, no address, office number, anything like that. Okay, what happens when you click the email address? Well, let's give it a little bit of functionality and have you be able to email somebody. And then the layout of the page, which is sometimes where I run into the most problems, is thinking about desktop versus tablet versus mobile. Obviously, in this day and age, we're dealing with a lot of different screens and a lot of different audiences for each screen. So trying to make sure that we've thought through how does this scale is really, really important. And then thinking, okay, well, where does the text go once we have this? Because obviously there's a lot of different options. We could get fancy and make it a hover. We could do all these other things. But thinking through all of these, there's obviously things I'm still missing. So what else would you guys want to get on a ticket if this was where you started?
What are the dimensions of the image?
Dimensions of the image?
Is there opening content text?
Yep, is there some kind of opening or intro text, header, menu, anywhere else that this lives, or is it just a page of faces?
Have we purchased a URL?
That's a good one. Purchasing a URL is always one of those things that people don't think about until they're ready to launch, and then you're sitting there going, oh yeah, that has to happen.
Are you giving the developer all of the contact information, or do they need to look it up themselves?
Do the developers have the correct information? Do they have to go hunt it down first and then get building? Yes.
How are you securing the information?
How are you securing the information? Also important. Yes.
Will users be able to search for a particular congressperson's contact information?
Search. All of these are great questions that if we were a development team working together, we would want to have answered before we got started on this ticket. Because or else we'd sit there and look at each other at the end and be like, are we sure we built this correctly? Are we positive? Versus being able to head these questions off early is incredibly helpful and beneficial to the entire team. Because then you're able to take that step back and say, okay, we can be confident that we know what we're building and the client knows what they're getting. And in the meantime, we haven't run around in circles the entire time. Because anytime we've gone through tickets, if we're not sure, we've asked. Or we've highlighted that we're making an assumption. And I think sometimes that's just as important, because 6 months down the road, if your project goes on hold, if priorities change, if you get inundated with bugs, which is what used to happen at my first job, we'd get gung-ho on a project, everyone would be like, yeah, we'd talk about all the requirements, we'd groom them all out, they'd all have points, and then all of a sudden we'd spend 2 weeks bug fixing something else. It's like, great, now we're going to get started on this other project, but now everything we've talked about is 2 weeks stale. So I like to also look at requirements as how do I future-proof this? How do I not make my future self really angry at my past self for not thinking things through, not answering these questions? Because sometimes somebody will mention something to me offhand, I'll be like, that's a great idea. And then I'll look back and be like, oh, good, I already thought about that one. But more often than not, it's, ooh, I missed that one. Why didn't I think about that earlier? Or, hey, yeah, that's something I'll definitely keep in mind. And then 2 weeks later, ooh, yeah, I forgot to keep that in mind. Now we have to fix things. So same with when developers have to comment their code, writing clean requirements and writing clean tickets is incredibly important because it will help make your life easier. And if nothing else, it's always nice to make things easier for yourself, right? So with that, questions? Yes.
Could you, I guess, just talk more about the Fibonacci sequence and how you apply that?
Sure. Sure, so the question was about applying the Fibonacci sequence, and the idea is using, I'm going to go back to that slide so I have the numbers up there too. Oops, that one. So the idea with those is it creates buckets. So rather than saying, we can give them sizes, you can give them a lot of other value, but by creating point values and giving everything a physical number, you're also able to calculate how many points you're averaging over the week. It's a lot harder to say small, medium, and large, how many tasks equate other things. So for example, if you have a really, really large task and determine it to be a 13 or a 21, can you break that down into smaller tasks that, you know, it might be that 2 3s is a 5 and not a 6. Sometimes that's the way it works out, but sometimes those tasks, because they're distinct, need to be separated anyway. So it's really how do we break down these buckets? And part of the reason I also only went to 13 here is that anytime a ticket goes over 13, there's usually a lot of assumption or lack of clarity in the ticket that people are instinctively trying to build into that understanding. And it's really, really challenging. So then the idea there is taking a step back and saying, is there a piece we understand? Is there a piece that we know we can deliver independent of the rest of this piece? So we can say, this is something we know, and this will give us enough teaching to be able to turn that 21 into multiple tickets where we can give actionable items in smaller pieces rather than, well, it's going to roll over from sprint to sprint because we still don't know what to do. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Any other questions? Well, great. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great rest of your afternoon.